What is it that makes a writer's voice compelling? Is it where they came from, things they've experienced, or what they believe? Today I'm going to be investigating what I believe makes a writer's voice compelling, and two of the biggest factors being war and religion, particularly on how those things influenced writers in the fantasy genre over the past 100 years, with writers such as Tolkien, Frank Herbert, and J.R.R. Martin, and why I think storytelling has become significantly devoid of substantial meaning. Here's a very simple display that I think breaks down the influence and impact of the quality of each of these writers. J.R.R. Tolkien was enlisted to fight in World War I at the age of 22, where he fought on the front lines in the Battle of Somme and contracted trench fever from lice. The greatest tragedy that Tolkien faced, however, was not of personal afflictions to his body, but the death of all his friends from high school who fought beside him in the war. Let's contrast that now with Herbert and Martin's experiences, or really lack thereof. Frank Herbert enlisted in the U.S. Navy around 1942 and served for 6 months as a photographer, where he spent most of his time doing paperwork and playing poker. He was then discharged from a reported head injury. J.R.R. Martin was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, performing instead in a civilian service with the Cook County Legal Assistance Foundation in Chicago. A lot can be concluded by not just how these wars affected society, but how they affected each of these authors' worldviews. World War I was a power struggle from European nations that resulted in the collapse of 4 major empires, 30 million lives, with the use of trench warfare that utilized chemical weapons, all of which Tolkien experienced firsthand. World War II was fought over the ideological push of fascism from Germany, Italy, and Japan. That war resulted in 60 to 80 million deaths. The greatest effect of World War II was arguably that Europe no longer was a superpower. Women stepped into the workforce as well during this time, causing social changes regarding gender roles, and greater national bureaucratic control with NATO. Jumping ahead a couple decades to the war that J.R.R. Martin grew up in was the Vietnam War, and that was part of the greater Cold War that was happening at the time. The Vietnam War was fought over a divided Vietnam of communist control from Ho Chi Minh and the South controlled by the U.S. A war largely regarded as unjust by the United States and caused the United States to divide over the issue. The effect was that distrust of the government became very popular, demoralization of what our values were as a country, ushering in nihilistic and Eastern philosophies. And that's how we end up with a Frank Herbert and J.R.R. Martin. Frank Herbert is a self-defined Zen Buddhist, and the story of Dune is heavily laced in Islamic symbolism, with the messianic protagonist ending up a lost cause, misguided in his intentions. And I will say, I've only seen the Dune movies, the Denis Villeneuve ones that have come out over the past 10 years, had very limited interest in pursuing even this one coming out later this year, because the films are just very dark and dreary and drab, and nothing of substance from the characters. It's really all style over substance, in my opinion. Game of Thrones, I don't even care to look into because I know it's filled with debauchery and nihilism with no real principle of good versus evil or worldview grounding that is anything like my own. This, I'm pretty sure, stems from the fact that from what I researched about J.R.R. Martin, he claims to be agnostic who leans atheist. Any story worth telling, I believe should be grounded in a moral framework that understands good and evil. And I believe it is the Christian worldview that gives the best framework for understanding good and evil. And it's that worldview that gives Lord of the Rings a solid framework of morality through which to understand what truly motivates characters towards both good and evil. It is a Christian ethos that Harry Potter assumes as well, although written from a more feminine point of view. The Western world has been defined and grounded by Christian principles for the past 500 years at least. Because despite what nihilism or Zen Buddhism will try and sell you about how all is corrupt or arbitrary, you have to remember that there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. That no matter what, Jesus is a king.